Francesca is a research fellow in sociology at the School of Social and Political Sciences. And prior to rejoining the University of Glasgow, she worked as a lecturer in the Department of Central and East European Studies at the University of Glasgow and held an ESRC fellowship at London South Bank University. She's principal investigator on the ESRC funded project Intimate Migrations, exploring the experiences of lesbian, gay and bisexual migrants from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union living in Scotland. Okay, Francesca.
Okay, thank you. Okay, today I'm going to talk a little bit. This is very much a work in progress because we've just started the project in January this year and the project will finish in December 2016. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges, ethical, methodological, language-related challenges that we're facing, but also give you some snippets of preliminary findings, drawing mainly from the pilot project which I conducted in 2013. And I'm working in this project with two colleagues, Moya Flynn, who is the co-investigator, and Anna Gavlevich, who is the researcher. So this paper was written with Anna. Just to start, I just wanted to kind of give you a few points about the kind of theoretical and conceptual challenges and thinking that we've been doing in kind of putting together the proposal, and so this is the lines along which we are thinking. I mean, one of the things that was really striking when we were working on the proposal is that there is quite a lot of literature on LGBT, queer migration, but it mainly seems to come from the US, and in the last few years, it seems to have really come on. There's been much more research on the topic, and of course, there are people like Nick Mai, who is in the room, who has been doing this for a long time. But in general, there is definitely a bias towards the US in the existing literature. And if we look at the existing literature, what is interesting is how some of this literature, particularly the likes of Lubed and Cantu, set a bit of an agenda for sexuality and migration studies in the 90s. So this is an extract from the introduction to their edited collection, which I think is called Queer Migration. And so they try to kind of think about causes and processes of migration in relation to sexuality. How does sexuality shape migration processes and flows? They think about borders and the immigration regimes that migrants face. They also think about how migration reconfigures US queer communities and how sexuality may be a source of conflict within migrant communities and between migrant and US communities. There is a huge amount of attention here to issues around race, which again seems to perhaps be, maybe not as prominent in European work on sexuality and migration. So in terms of the kind of key points that we've taken away from our literature review, one point is that attempts to theorize queer migration have mainly focused on internal rural to urban migration rather than international migration. And so, for example, if we look at work by the likes of Weston, but also more kind of cultural studies work, such as by the likes of Sally Mund, for example, we see that there is a strong link that is positive between rural to urban migration and coming out. So migration is a process that people undertake to know oneself as gay or lesbian or bisexual, etc., etc. However, others, such as Gorman Murray and Weston to an extent, have sort of queried this strong emphasis on identity and on coming out in these conceptualizations. And they have argued that this notion of migration as a queer identity quest actually overlooks the diversity of migration patterns and experiences. and the materialities of migration. So who is able to move, who is not able to move, and the different channels and trajectory that are available to different people. Gorman-Murray also argues that perhaps we should move away from this assumption that people migrate, from this focus on rural urban migration as a scale of displacement, to thinking more of the motivations of individual migrants and migrant trajectories. And this is a point that lies at the core of what we're trying to do. So, this idea of kind of moving away from an assumption that people move necessarily because of their sexuality, and unpacking more the broad and complex reasons why people may want to move. However, we also take the work of Gorman-Murray as a point of departure, because Gorman-Murray still places a lot of emphasis on sexuality in the way he defines queer migration. So he talks about 3 types of queer migration: coming out migration, moving to reinvent the self as non-heterosexual and to explore bodily sexual desires in the process; gravitational group migration, when people move to be in a neighborhood or in a city with a strong LGBT presence; and he talks about relationship migration, when people move with a partner or after a relationship breakdown. But he also says that queer migration is not the migration of queers for reasons other than their sexuality. And we argue that, that actually this misses out a lot of the reasons why people may want to move, and kind of misses out the materialities of migration. And so we adopt a more holistic notion of queer migration. So we are interested in exploring how sexuality may shape the trajectories of people who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, regardless of whether sexuality is actually their primary reason for migrating. We're interested in how this may shape, for example, the process of settlement, but also the kind of social networks that they create once they have migrated to a new country, and possibly social networks that span across more than one country. So, as I said at the beginning, there seems to be little or less research on migration to Europe and within Europe. And what we are trying to do in this project is focus very much on LGB migration within Europe. We are doing this because we are kind of trying to kind of move away in a way from this single story of people moving away from a homophobic Eastern Europe towards a progressive Western Europe. The way we're kind of framing the study is that there has been a very substantive movement of people from the post-socialist region to the UK and to Scotland, we also can see that there are very different institutional contexts across Europe in terms of policy and legislation concerning LGBT citizens. However, there is often an assumption again that sexuality or gender identity is people's primary reason to move, and actually this assumption perhaps needs to be empirically tested against migrants' often complex motivations and experiences. So we explore the role sexuality plays in motivations to migrate, experiences of migration, and plans for long-term resettlement. I can talk later about why we're focusing on Scotland, and as you will notice, we're not using the term queer for reasons that I can explain. We are also talking about LGB migration. We're not including the T. This doesn't mean the LGB migrants that we are talking to necessarily have to be cisgender, so they're not people who identify as transgender are not necessarily excluded from this study. And it is a decision that we have taken in consultation with some LGBT organizations in Scotland who have been involved in the project advisory group, or they will have consulted while setting up the project. So the kind of questions that we are looking at are specifically designed in a way to move away from this single story of flight because of persecution of or discrimination from a homophobic Eastern Europe or post-socialist region that we often encounter in the media. And so we are looking at people's reasons to migrate to and settle in Scotland. And we are very much taking an intersectional perspective and we are trying to unpack how how sexuality kind of plays alongside other factors such as socioeconomic background, gender, nationality, migrant status in people's experiences. We're also looking at how LGB migrants negotiate their sense of security and belonging through their social networks across Scotland and their home country, sometimes across different countries actually, because some of the people we have spoken to have moved across more than one country. And again, we are kind of drawing on an intersectional perspective here about people's sense of belonging and people's personal communities. I would also like to add that this ties in with another project that Moya Flynn is involved in that looks at perceptions of social security among migrants from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in Scotland, where social security is understood in a very broad sense, so beyond welfare. It's kind of understood in terms of materialities, but also emotional sides of security. And so, but often, one thing that is very different to capture in these broader projects about, migration is sexuality, because this is something which is not necessarily very visible, that sometimes, people don't feel it's appropriate to ask migrants about. And so in this sense, the study fills a gap. In terms of stages of the project, we are doing this in 2 stages. We are currently in the middle of conducting stage 1. So we are planning to conduct 50 biographical interviews with lesbian, gay, bisexual migrants from the post-socialist region. And so in the first interview, we very much focus on their experiences back in their home country, their kind of socioeconomic background, their experiences in relation to their sexuality, their reasons to migrate, their reasons for settling in Scotland, for coming to Scotland particularly. Sometimes people come to other parts of the UK first, but actually most of the people we have spoken to migrated directly to Scotland. We're also asking people at the end of the interview to draw a sociogram, which is basically a mind map of the most important people in their lives. And we then ask people, so this in the picture here you have an example of a sociogram, and we then ask people to talk about these people, why they're important to them and how they fit into their personal communities. The second stage, which hasn't really started properly, involves photo diaries with at least, we're hoping, half of the people who have taken part in the first stage. And the theme of the photo diaries is home, and we are trying to kind of get to people's kind of sense of belonging in a broader sense, and this will then be followed up with more interviews focused more on the photo diary. We're also talking simultaneously with people from various types of voluntary and public sector organizations who may be working with LGB migrants. Often, this is maybe not on their radar because, for example, for LGBT organizations, they may not particularly be strong on, engaging with migrant communities. For migrant organizations, sexuality may be seen as a peripheral issues and so on. So we're kind of trying to get to speak to these people to kind of get a picture of what's available, what gaps are there in terms of services. And one thing that I forgot to say when I was talking about the research question is that the project also has a kind of an impact. I hate this term, but it's the inverted commas impact element to it, which is to kind of bring together people who, work with either migrants or minority ethnic or LGBT communities in Scotland, and to kind of bring them together to see if there's any kind of scope for collaborating on these issues. Okay, so in terms of recruitment and challenges, we have relied quite heavily on snowballing, almost exclusively on snowballing for the pilot study, and this is quite common in studies on, that address sensitive topics, or in studies on sexuality, and this has its limitations, and I can talk about it more later. So in the main study, where we initially snowballed through pilot study participants, we also have advertised we have a project website, we have posted messages on social media, particularly Facebook. We have relied on community organizations that are involved in the project advisory group to spread the word about the project. We have advertised by leaving leaflets in, for example, Polish, Russian, Eastern European shops in Glasgow and Edinburgh, LGBT venues, and so on. We have also considered ESOL classes as a way to kind of, spread the news about the project, involving people. And we think that the ESOL community may be interested in our findings, but our engagement so far with ESOL practitioners has actually been quite tentative, and partly through our own fault, because we've had not very much time to kind of particularly focus our energy on this. But if you have any kind of suggestions about how we may do this, these would be very welcome. In terms of challenges, we are trying to get a balanced sample in terms of gender. We're also trying to get a range of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. This is proving a challenge because, we've got a majority of people who are, I suppose, it's always difficult to talk about class in relation to migration, I think, and, we've, different people today spoke about the limitation of, terms of like class, but I suppose the majority of the people that we have spoken to so far are, quite highly educated and perhaps more on the kind of middle class kind of spectrum. We are limited in the, ideally, we would like to cover, to cover people from a range of countries, particularly to show the impact of migration status on people's experiences. However, the way we're trying to do it is to kind of let this be driven to an extent by the process of research itself. So we are expecting to recruit a lot of people from Poland, because this is a very big community in Scotland. We have spoken to people from Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. We are struggling at the moment to recruit Russian speakers. There's actually a lot of Russian speakers in Scotland, but they tend to come more from the Baltic states rather than Russia itself. And again, this is kind of linked to the fact that obviously it's easier for people to cross borders within the EU than for people to come from outside the EU. Ideally, we would like this to be a generally Scotland-wide study. So far, we have mostly spoken to people in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and it is proving more challenging, of course, to reach out to LGBT migrants who live in small town and rural Scotland, although we're kind of working on this, and we have a couple of interviews lined up in small town 5, so that's a start. Obviously, there's sensitivities around recruitment and the promotion of the study, even in terms of the kind of voluntary sector organizations who have been supporting the project. Sometimes sensitivities come up. For example, we are aware of the fact that there are organizations that focus more on migration and minority ethnic communities, and who maybe have a limited understanding around issues of sexuality, or may not feel comfortable making this public, although they are actually, in actual fact, supporting the project. And another challenge is navigating possible tensions between different agendas of community, voluntary sector organizations involved, in the PAG. We're going to have some consultations event, 2 consultations events throughout the project. And there are also potential tensions to do with migrant sense of belonging, so particularly the perception that, certain migrant communities may be, more homophobic, or they may be experienced as homophobic, but, this has actually not proven to be the case in the early stages of the project. We have managed to speak to quite a few people, and they didn't particularly seem to have an issue with us leaving leaflets in their shop about, a project on LGB migrants. One issue that we are interested in is the issue of language, and I think there are often missed opportunities in social science research to engage with language not just as a matter of definition, but also, as something to be researched, to be kind of delved into, and that can tell us a lot about, social life. We are limited in this respect in terms of language skills, so ideally we'd like to give everyone the opportunity to be interviewed in their own language, but unfortunately we're limited to Polish and Russian, and we have been speaking to people who are not Polish or Russian speakers in English. We have considered involving other people in the research process as interpreters or interviewers. So we thought about advocacy workers from an organization that is involved in our project advisory group, but actually, this seems to be quite tricky because there is the potential for, again, people feeling not comfortable being interviewed by a member of their own ethno-national community, and it's something that we have discussed with, the PAG. So for the moment, this is on hold. We may do it in future, but I think we will only do it if we develop enough, trust and kind of good working relations with a particular person that we know can do the job, and, that we feel comfortable, with entrusting them with this task. In terms of preference regarding the language of the interview, this is something that came up in the PAG. So a couple of people were saying, and when we first met with the project advisory group, well, some people may actually prefer to be interviewed in English because they may not have a vocabulary in their own language to talk about issues to do with sexuality. So far, we actually haven't found this to be the case because, there is maybe an assumption that, well, in these societies, there isn't a language to talk about sexuality. We didn't find this to be the case at all with people who migrated when they were older, so in their 20s or 30s. This has only come up once in the interview with a young woman who migrated to Scotland when she was 19 to go to university in Scotland. And I think it's something that is perhaps more tied with her age rather than, the absence of a language to talk about sexuality in her own society. It's interesting as well that obviously interviews that we have been able to conduct in people's first language are different from interviews conducted in English. For example, people tend to be much more expressive in terms of the emotions and the range of emotion, the subtlety that they can express in their own language. And also when doing interviews in English, it's more difficult to pick up on queer slang, so the kind of everyday words that people use to talk about sexuality and gender. I don't know how much time I've got, so I can skip this if I'm pressed for time. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a couple of snippets from the pilot study. And in the pilot study, what was interesting is that people often talked about sexuality alongside with other reasons for migrating. So, for example, in the quote from Yaroslav, he talks about, better quality of life abroad, as well as, the UK being perceived as more open about gay people, and this kind of echoes in other interviews. So we kind of encountered a range of experiences. So for some people, sexuality was definitely not a consideration in their decisions to migrate. For others, it was very prominent, and most people were somehow in the middle. And there were two men in particular that I remember of who, talked about sexuality as being their main reason for migrating. their experiences was not so much of an experience of discrimination or persecution on the basis of their sexuality in public spaces, but it was something more to do with either struggling to kind of make sense of their sexuality, coming to terms with their sexuality. For someone like Adam, who talks about his strong Catholic faith and living in a monastery for a while as a monk, and then coming out and trying to live a heterosexual life, and then working as a religious teacher, and feeling really hypocritical and really terrible about himself about living this double life, and then deciding to kind of just leaving everything and going abroad as a way to kind of move away from this and starting a new life. And there is another Bulgarian man who talked very much about his life abroad, first in Cyprus and then in Scotland, as his second life, because he had a very difficult situation at home with a violent father who was basically terrifying both him as a gay man and his mum. But it's interesting that although sexuality doesn't often come into reasons for migrating, it often comes in when people talk about their reasons for staying in Scotland. For example, there were quite a few people in the pilot study who were either in a civil partnership or who were planning to enter a civil partnership. And in the case of Marek, he was planning to get civilly partnered to his Scottish partner. But often, this consideration of like, having recognition for your relationship and, comes into the way in which people talk about reasons for staying. A very final point is related to homophobia in Scotland and back home. Again, there is often a perception from the way the media portray, post-socialist Eastern Europe, that these countries are very homophobic. But one thing that was quite striking about the pilot project, is that there were a few instances in which people talked about experiencing homophobia in Scotland. And actually, it's interesting that the most blatant cases of harassment happened in Scotland rather than in people's country of origin. So Jaroslav again talks about how him and his partner, his cohabiting partner, were harassed by two local teenagers who threw stones at them, smashed their car, and they were shouting, "Fuck off, you fucking poofs, fucking Poles, go back from where you come from." And obviously there is much more going on here than just homophobia. But it's interesting that our perception is that this, homophobia is not just something that happens over there. It also happens in Scotland, despite of a very different policy and legislative backdrop. So, attitudes do not always match this kind of institutional setting. And the second point is that people tended to kind of talk about how they experience homophobia back home in different ways, as silence, as misrecognition, rather than being targeted, being the target of homophobic harassment. And this again is quite encapsulated quite well here by Jaroslav when he says, he talks about going back to Poland for a holiday and meeting an elderly woman at the airport. And she was like, "Oh, are you living here? Do you have a house and everything?" "Yes." "So do you have a wife and children?" "No, I'm gay." "Oh, really?" And then an awkward silence followed. And this is how he talks about, his experience of, being gay and then going back to Poland. So that's everything. So thank you very much.
Francesca, for that. Pretty interesting to sort of think about moving on to think about methodology and things like that. We'll take just one question, and then we'll move on, and there'll be time for more questions at the end, in the very final session. So,
thank you very much. I've got a question about methodology. You said one of your methods was participant observation. I was wondering whether you could.
Yeah, this is something that there's a bit of a question mark. I left it in the slides, but it's something we are considering because we are aware of, it's something that came up from the pilot study of a couple of bars that are not necessarily gay bars, but they have been used in the past by groups of gay men in Edinburgh as a place to meet. And so, we kind of thought of perhaps doing some participant observation in these settings. But participant observation is very marginal to actually this study. It's something that I have used more in the past in other research that I've done in, I've done some research in Russia about the experiences of lesbian and bisexual women. I have used that more. But I think because of the way we have structured the study, this is probably bound to be quite peripheral and something quite ad hoc as we find out about these kind of spaces. So, yeah.
Well, I think Nick has just gone to the loo, so there's time for another question. Maybe he wants to get one.
Good timing.
Yeah, you're Lucy, yes.
Thank you, that's very interesting. I wondered if so far you've managed to gauge people's experiences of using gay spaces, such as the gay scene, and whether they've experienced any prejudice or whether they've managed to get a sense of belonging. And I ask this question because in my own work on BME communities, what I found is that often people migrate, come to the UK, not necessarily just because they feel that they'll be more accepted, but it's an expectation that they will get some acceptance on the basis of their sexual identity. But sometimes they're disappointed when they face overt racism or they feel they're objectified on the basis, because, you know, for various reasons on the basis of their ethnic identity. So I was wondering how it plays out with Eastern European migrants.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, these are very preliminary findings, but it's something that hasn't actually come up majorly from interviews. And I mean, the people we have spoken to don't seem to majorly engage with, you know, commercial spaces or community spaces. And I mean, we're trying to kind of look into why this may be. Is it because people experience prejudice, or is it because people don't have the time to go to these places, don't have the means, they'll work long hours? We found that, for example, that, you know, some of the participants from the pilot study, they kind of tend to have their own network of friends. They often dated other men through gaydar and the likes, but they didn't actually, so they engaged more in virtual spaces rather than actual physical spaces. Or there was a group of gay men who for a while met at a pub in Edinburgh, but it was a group that they created through Facebook again, and they decided that it was important for them to meet as gay men from Poland and to kind of share these experiences. We don't have much of a sense of whether people may encounter discrimination specifically in LGBT settings, but this is definitely something that has come up in a few interviews, like prejudice against, you know, migrants, against Eastern Europeans, and so on. And I mean, I think one other interesting issue to look at is language, and this is something that came up from an interview with a woman who migrated to Scotland as a teenager from Poland with her family, and she talks about how, you know, growing up in this mixed family, but with Polish siblings and a Polish mother, she wasn't particularly confident in her English, and so one of the issues that she talks about when exploring the scene is around not understanding people, or kind of feeling uncomfortable because she can't make herself understood, or people, you know, doesn't understand people. So I think that's another interesting.
The reason I ask is because it relates to one of your research questions around belonging.
Yeah.
That could be one source of
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something we're trying to explore by looking at people's social networks. So is ethno-national belonging, ethnicity, an important element in how people socialize, and not so we're trying to kind of move away from an exclusive focus on sexuality to also consider, you know, how ethnicity may play a part in that. So thank you.